You want to turn to Numbers 13. I know we did not finish the Gospel of John yet. We'll get back to him eventually, but this particular sermon came upon me, and I came up probably about 8 or 10 others that we're going to look at, all with the idea of putting the line in the sand. Now, we know what that means, I hope, that when we talk about drawing a line in the sand, that means we're to the point, that's it, that we will not cross. Another way I would put that is my line of integrity, that here comes a point that I'm not crossing this anymore. And what we're going to see here in Numbers 13, and we're going to see it in several sermons, is this idea of this is it. Every one of us has to have this line of integrity, that we're not going to cross it for anybody, and that we're standing where we're standing. The reason I think that this has all come to me this way is the fact that I see in the church today, not Centennial necessarily, but the church in general, there is no line of integrity. I see compromise after compromise after compromise after compromise. And then we wonder why the church doesn't have the influence in the world it's supposed to have. We wonder why, and that's it. Whenever somebody wants to destroy the truth, one of the things that they will do is they will try to muddy the waters over the truth. Okay? That we live in a society that if we want to know what is true, it seems like it depends on what we want to be true. And that's where all this starts, okay? Genesis chapter 3, we're going to look at in our Sunday school class today. The question that occurs there between Eve and Satan is Satan gets her confused. What did God say? And because the Bible is not something that is very strong in most churches anymore, there's a lot of people that don't know what it says. Okay? So how do I know where to stand if I don't know what the truth is? And that's what we're going to look at in these sermons as we look at the line in the sand. So I want to set this up for us. We're going to talk about the history of Israel as we begin. That here we are, Moses, and we just talked about that downstairs too. Moses goes into Egypt. I won't go all the way back to the very beginning, but the burning bush experience that he has, he goes into Egypt and he delivers Israel out, and during that time God works these plagues upon Egypt. Okay? Now what we will learn if we want to go into Exodus and study it, and I think we ought to because I think it's a fantastic study, that every one of these plagues is against the Egyptian God. That every one of these is showing that the God of Israel is superior to the gods of Egypt. And Moses is very successful through the power of God to work these plagues. So after the final plague happens, the plague of the firstborn, that Moses then takes these people out, and we see the crossing of the Red Sea. They cross the Red Sea, they go into the land of where they're going to eventually end up in Mount Sinai there at the mountain of God, and God's going to deliver to them the Old Testament laws we know it. I know we say the Ten Commandments, but there was a whole much more involved in that than just the Ten Commandments. So what happens then, they don't have anything to eat. So if they don't have anything to eat, what did they do? What's the best thing? Who said that? What'd you say?
They complain.
Complain. We as human beings are really good at that. Okay, we have practiced a lot evidently. We know how to complain when we don't have what we think we want. So God sends this sugary type cracker down called manna. Okay? If you know the background there, then you'll have a better idea of what Jesus is speaking of in John 6 when he talks about being the bread of life, because he compares himself to this manna. So we have this food to eat, but Marge, we're tired of it. We need something else. So what does God do? He sends the quail down to them, so they've got meat to eat. So finally, they have the bread, they have the meat, so what's left? Chocolate cake, Katie, is that what you said? Oh, water. So what does God do with that? He has Moses speak to this rock, and the water flows out, and it follows the people of Israel. I like the chocolate cake idea, don't I? So, okay? So they now have everything they need, and finally they come to the promised land. I know that's a quick tour here, but now we're at the point that they're ready to go into the promised land. Okay? So what happens here is that when God tells Moses what they're about to do, then Moses sent out these spies to check out the land, and they come back And it is this land flowing with what? Milk and honey, okay? And man, it is just fantastic. It's exactly what God said it would be. But the problem being is that there are a lot of obstacles in the way. Now what are we going to do? Okay? So what happens then is when they get back here, they have this big problem, and these 12 spies come and they report back to Moses. Okay? So when they come back, they say, here's all this great stuff that's there. And God is right, it's the land flowing with milk and honey. But then they have this, well, when there's a big decision to be made by a church, what do? Who said it? Congregational meeting, right? Okay? And that's what happens here. If you look in, let's see, what is it? Verse, I do not see it right now, but that's all right. It says the whole congregation of chapter 14, verse 1, the whole community, it says there. The whole congregation now meets together to decide what they are supposed to do. I mean, majority rules, right? Not in the church. The church is not a democracy. It never was. One of the greatest failings of the church in the United States is this idea that we're supposed to vote on everything, and the majority of that vote is how you determine what you're going to do. Okay? In this case, it works out, and it's exactly the opposite of what God told them to do. Okay? So they have this meeting about all this stuff. The church is a theocracy. It is ruled by God, not by what people think, not by majority rule. And I think that that's where the problem begins here. Okay? There's a story about a minister that had prayed and prayed and prayed, and he came up with this idea for the church that he thought would be a fantastic thing to do. And he went to the board to vote, and the board voted 14-1 not to do what this preacher wanted to do. And then what happened? Out of the clear blue sky, this huge bolt of lightning comes down, hits the building, knocks them everywhere across that room. It just demolishes the whole room. All these men are laying on the floor. The chairman of the board looks up, the preacher says, okay, 14-2. But it still didn't pass. Okay? Are we guilty of that at times? See, this is what happens here because they misunderstood. Well, I have one more. James Strauss was the professor of Lincoln, very intelligent man, and he always gave me this idea. He said, Joe, a camel is the result of a committee that was supposed to invent a horse. Okay? Meaning what? Committees don't function right. They don't come down to the truth of what God wants. See, here's the problem we got into here. When you look at, God did not tell them to vote on whether they should go in there or not. You read the text. What did God say? You go out and you check out the land that I gave you. There's no decision to be made here. God's already made the decision. He's handed the land to you. Go explore it. And then you're going to go in and you're going to take the land. I certainly believe, that as a church, if we would do more praying, we would do a lot less decision making. That if we would look to see what God wants us to do, it's going to be there. The only thing we decide is how to accomplish it. For us to sit and decide by majority rule what the will of God is foolishness. That's what happened here. That these 12 spies went out and everybody saw the same thing, but they drew different conclusions. Isn't that amazing? Okay. Everybody knows that last Monday night, the Chicago Bears cheated. Yeah. Everybody sees, I mean, the big deal now about the debate is that what? Mitt Romney lied. Well, we get it confused what our role is. These people got confused what they were supposed to be doing. It wasn't their decision whether to take the land or not. God already said, take it. Go check it out and see what it's like. And they decided, nope, we're not going to do it. You have any idea? That is not really a foreign language, it is kind of. Anybody know what's on that screen right now? The 10 spies that wouldn't go. How many of you know that those names by heart? Who were the two that said, yes, we should go? God's given it to us. Let's just go. Joshua and Caleb. See, we remember the people that had faith. The reason that these men are not known because they didn't have faith. They decided not to go because of the obstacles that are there. And I want you to know, through all the years of ministry, whenever there's an obstacle, in the midst of that obstacle, there's an opportunity. That God is there. He wants them to take the land. He gave it to them. It wasn't a matter of anything else. He gave it to them, and they were supposed to take it. These 10 come back, and they see all these obstacles, and they did two things. One of the things that they did is they exaggerated the obstacle. We always do. We always do. It is Mark Twain that once said that I worried about a lot of things in my life, some of which actually happened. What is the old saying? 85% of what we worry about never comes to pass. But we are negative people by nature. And what that negativity shows to us is that there's a lack of faith in this. That these men are looking at themselves, and they look at the obstacle, and what do they say to themselves and to the people? We can't do it. And you know what? They're right. When we look at what is before us as far as God's concerned, if we say we can't do it, we're absolutely right. We can't. We can't. These 10 men left who out of the picture? God. He's already said He was going to give them the land. Why can't you take it then? Okay? We'll get to the result of this, which was far greater than anybody would think. But Joshua and Caleb encouraged the people. Let's obey God. He's given it to us. Surely we're going to take it because God promised it to us. But the negative people, no, we're not going to do that. They don't know what faith is. They've complained, if you want to read the book of Exodus and Numbers up to this point, they've complained about everything that's happened all the way up here. Okay? They upset because there's no food to eat, and then there's no meat, and then there's no water, and then there's no this. And then they start grumbling about, let's just go back to Egypt. It was better back there. Now, what's the problem with that statement? It wasn't better back there. They were slaves. They were getting worked to death. So what? They just saw these obstacles and said, we don't want to try that. We have left God out of the picture. Folks, how many times in the church do we leave God out of the picture when we go to make a decision? It's what I like, what I want, what I prefer, what I think. And we leave Him out of the picture completely. And He's already promised us that He's going to allow us to do His will and give us everything that we need. So we have to look at our lives and say, do I live by faith or by human calculation? When I look at what's before me in my life, whether it's an individual, as far as the church is concerned, is it just a matter of my power, my intelligence, my ability? Or do I look to say God is here? It is by faith that we can accomplish what God has told us. So these people come back. There's two guys over here saying, yes, we can do it. God has shown it to us. He has promised us. There's 10 over here that says, no, there's no way we can do it. They yell louder than the positive people do. So what happens? The people decide what? Nope, can't do it. We can't do it. And then what happens is this rebellion. Now, not just because I'm the minister, but I think there's an important point I want to make here, that when the people start complaining about Moses, when they start complaining about the leadership of the Israelites, you know what God calls that? Sin. Sin. That we are not to criticize those that are leading us. That's why we have to be very careful about who we choose to lead us. That we are to follow them. Moses has been a great leader. The elders of Israel have been great leaders. But now what they're going to do disagrees with the people, and the people start complaining about all this. They begin to doubt what God is able to do. They chose to believe the unbelieving spies rather than the faithful living God. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? That we would look at these folks that have already proven they don't have any faith, and we would look at what God has said, and we're going to choose these people over what God has said. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. But you see, all that they had seen and heard Did they have bad memories? Just think for a moment what these people have experienced with God. They saw the plagues against Egypt. They saw God separate the waters in the Red Sea. They were there at the mountain of God saying, we'll do anything and everything you want us to do. They saw God provide the manna, the quail, the water, just on and on and on. They've seen Him do all of this. And now when it comes to a point they need to trust Him for the next step, they say, nope. Isn't it amazing? Okay? But before we get too critical with the people of Israel, what about us? All that we have seen God do. All that we have seen God accomplish in our lives. And when He says the next step to trust Him, we say, oh, I don't know. I don't know whether we can do that or not. It is easier, it is safer to be negative and pessimistic. And in all honesty, when you see someone's negative and pessimistic about everything, isn't it just a joy to be around them? I mean, oh wow, it's just really, really great. You know, there are those people that find something wrong with anything, and if they don't find it wrong, they'll look until they do find something wrong with it. The man that told his wife to scramble one egg and fry the other one for breakfast. And she puts it down on the table and he throws it off onto the floor. She said, what's wrong? He said, you fried the wrong egg. And I mean, we can just go on and on. I got all kinds of stupid stories like that. How can we, in the presence of God, if we are Christians, if we believe in Jesus Christ, how can we be negative about anything? We've already won. Romans chapter 8, we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. There's no reason. What is there that God can't do? See, that's the question that we have to look at. Is He able to give Israel the promised land? And the answer is absolutely. So you answer a question for me. How is it that we believe that our faith in Jesus will get us into heaven, but we're not sure He'll get us through the next day? That He can overcome this great obstacle to get me into the promised land, into the heaven, but I can't trust Him to help me through the obstacles of this life. Explain to me the logic in that. He can do whatever He wants to do. He is for us, and I think that we have to understand that. He is there to help us. But those negative voices, always something wrong, always something critical. You know, this will never work. It's like when Robert Fulton invented the steamship. He was on this big lake to test it for the first time, in a small version, of course, and there was a guy standing in the crowd saying, he'll never get it to start. He'll never get it to start. He starts it up, and he starts going across the lake with it, and the guy yells, he'll never get it stopped. He'll never get it stopped. Always something that we can be critical. I don't understand why. I don't understand how that can happen. That it is easy for us to talk the talk. We can use all the religious words and we can talk about how great God is, but what when it comes down to actually walking the walk? About when it comes down to when God says, love me more than anything else. Love your brother and sister as I've loved you. Those types of things. Then where do we end up at? Where are we in our walk? Whenever we're challenged, I'm sure there's others, but I've come up with these little sayings here that I've probably heard from more times through 30 years of preaching than any. When it comes to a challenge for the church, the death knell of the church is the first one. We've never done it before. Okay? I don't know how. I'm afraid to try. I don't have time. Someone else can do it. I don't have the money. Some people are not going to like it. I never realized that it was about what people would like. I thought it was about obeying God. I thought it was about going out to accomplish what God had set for us to do. There were some people that were going to like going to the promised land. But I don't read here where God was concerned about that. He wanted them to accomplish what they were supposed to accomplish. And here they have this challenge before them, and there's a little discomfort. There's this chance that we're going to have to do something, and they're ready to go back to Egypt. And when all other excuses fail, they start criticizing Moses. Who is this fellow Moses? Why would we want to follow him? Look what he has done through God all the way here, and then all at once. Public opinion is very fickle, isn't it? You see, when I fail to have faith, it limits what God can do. When I will not trust Him to set forth to accomplish what He wants me to accomplish, then He's not going to do it here. Now, I want you to understand that as far as Centennial Christian Church is concerned, if we decide not to be people of faith, if we decide not to step forward and do what God wants us to do, He's going to find somebody to do it. We don't have a corner on the market here. We're going to miss the blessing. We're going to miss the reward of that, but He's going to get it done. It's like Esther in the book of Esther. Mordecai says, if you don't, God's going to raise somebody up, but it could be for this very purpose. He's put you where you're at. So let's go forward and accomplish that. But if you don't, Esther, God is going to save Israel somehow. You just will miss out on what He is doing. The last thing that I would want to do in my life is to miss out on what God's doing. To sit here comfortable and do whatever and have a good time together, miss what God is calling us to do. I think that would be an absolute shame, and Israel is going to find out for themselves. It was an absolute shame. To miss the promised land. Isn't that where they were heading? Wasn't that the goal they wanted to get to? It was the promised land. And to get right to the border of it. What a shame to get to the very verge and fail. To get right to this point and then back off and never be able to do that. You know, we can look around and say a lot of good things, but God never judges on potential. He judges on faith and obedience. He doesn't ever look and say, here's what these people could do for me. It's what are you doing is what God is going to judge us for. And you know what happens here? It's a sad, sad story. Because when this happens, God has had enough of them. He's done. Now, we think that we can do whatever, and eventually God's going to forgive and everything will go on. But when we come to this point, God says, that's it. They've done this enough. They've done it often enough. This is it. I'm done with them. Anybody know what His judgment is?
I will not contend with them forever.
Well, that's Noah. He says everyone of age will never go into the promised land. They're going to die. They'll never get to go in. What a shame. What a shame. So for the next 40 years, these people will walk around in the wilderness. They can see the promised land. They can see it. But they're never going to be able to walk into it. Now, if you figure out the number of people that died there, folks, we're talking about 82 people a day dying for 40 years. Figure that out. They can see it right there, but they never go into it because of their lack of faith. I'm sure they didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. I'm sure they didn't. That they had this one last chance to do what God wanted them to do, and they blew it. And they will never get another chance again. There's a gentleman in the Bible that found himself in that same situation. That was King Saul. Israel wanted a king. And God says, no, you don't. He's going to tax you. Anybody know what taxes are? Okay. He's going to take your young men and put them in the army and all this stuff. You don't want a king. And they said, oh, yes, we do. And God said, well, you're rejecting me if you do that. So He allows Israel to pick Saul. And Saul starts out as a pretty decent guy, but then he gets too prideful. He becomes arrogant. He does some things he shouldn't do. And here is Samuel presenting him. There's three basic things that Saul does that we're not going to get into right here. But the last one was he was supposed to destroy the Amalekites. He's supposed to kill Amalek the king, and he doesn't. He comes back, and the first thing that he says is, we have obeyed the Lord. And Samuel says, what's the bleating of the sheep and the mooing of the cows that I hear? You're supposed to destroy all of them. Well, I know, but the people save the best for God. So finally, through the conversation, 1 Samuel chapter 15, you know what Samuel says to Saul? God has ripped your kingdom away. He planned to let your family line be king forever, but not now. Not now. Because you have disobeyed the God, your Lord. Telltale sign for Saul was when he says, let's go back and worship the Lord your God. No longer his. He has strayed away from God. He is still king of Israel, supposedly, and he will be for quite some time after this. But you read the life of Saul. He came to a point, and God rejected him, and that was it. And the rest of his life is a mess, all the way through to the time that he technically commits suicide because of his lack of faith. Then the resolve. We've still got two good guys here, Joshua and Caleb. They're the two positive people. They believed, they trusted, but the problem is they got yelled down. All these other people, negative people are always louder than positive people. And they got yelled down and finally could do nothing with that. And here we see that these 10 and the people saw this challenge in light of their own abilities, not what God can do. And that's the whole thing that makes this fall apart. There are great obstacles, but there are also great opportunities because we worship a great God. It is Joshua and Caleb that focused on God and say, let's go do this. We can trust God. He has said that we can trust Him, and we've trusted Him, and He has proved true all the way through. So let's go do that. And with our faith, the possibilities of what God can do are endless. They are endless. And as a result of their faith, they receive the promises of God. Joshua's leader of Israel when they go into the land of Canaan. Caleb stands before God. He's 85 years old. And you have to look in the book of Joshua to see his statement. He says, I am as strong now at 85 than I was when I was 40, when all this happened. That they received this promise. And the city of Hebron is what Caleb was able to inherit because of his faith. So the result is that it's such a shame. They were so close to fulfill God's will, but because of their lack of faith, they failed. There are times that we can set goals, but we never achieve them. That we can get close to them, but never quite step over the line to where God would want us to be. We must remember that God has limits to them. Okay? The questions that He poses to these people. Their refusal to go into the promised land. What was God's response? How long will these people have contempt for me? That's a pretty strong word, isn't it? Do you think these people hated God? And the answer is, yes. If you love me, Jesus says, you'll obey my commandments. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. How long will they have contempt for me? How long will they refuse to believe me even though they have seen all these miraculous signs? How long till we believe God after we have seen Him work so many ways in the lives of so many people to accomplish so much? When will we believe then? And the third question is, how long will this, what? Wicked community. You see, the lack of faith in God is a sign of sinfulness and wickedness. Our refusal to allow God to work is that very thing. That when we choose not to listen to God, we will suffer the consequences of the decisions that we have made. And after this, after God tells them that they will not be allowed to go into the promised land, do you know what the first thing they tried to do was? Go into the promised land. And they got beat back horribly. Because why? They didn't obey God. They didn't obey God's will when God told them it was time to go. And then for the next 40 years now, that they are just going to walk around in the wilderness till everybody that's 18 years and older dies off because of their disobedience, their lack of faith. See, God will bring us to crossroads in our own lives. He will bring us to crossroads in the church life. And it's time for the church then to make a decision when we come to this crossroads. And one of the things that we have to understand is those decisions that we make have eternal consequences to them one way or the other. That if we choose not to obey God, we're going to go a whole different direction than if we choose to. So what is our response? If we believe that God has a vision for us in our life, He does. He does. He has a purpose for you in your life. I go out to Watsika Healthcare every week for Bible study, and that's one of the things that I spend quite a bit of time on talking to these folks, and they are very dear folks, very much so. That is a part of society that we have ignored, that we're missing a whole lot because we're not in the lives of these people. Okay? But these folks don't really think they have any purpose in life left. I mean, what do you go to a nursing home for? To die. That's the general consensus. So I'm no longer useful to society, so I go over and I sit here, I wait until that time that I die. And that is what society has told us, and that absolutely isn't true. There may be those of us here today that think that our purpose in life has been spent, and maybe there's not really anything else for God to do in my life. And I have this test, I think we've done it here before, but I have this test that I want to do with you that will determine whether you're right or not. Everybody hold up their right hand. Your other right hand. Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay. You take that right hand. I'm just going to let Ryan. Pete. I got my eye on you guys now. Put that right hand on your chest. Hear your heartbeat. He still has a purpose for you. Because if he didn't, it wouldn't be beating. Okay? He has a purpose for us. Are we going to be determined to do that, what God wants us to do? If we believe that God has a purpose for us, if we have a vision for what God can do in our lives, then why are we satisfied with the status quo? Why are we satisfied with, we've always done it that way. I can't do it. I'm afraid to try. We don't have the money. We don't have this. All these things that we look at our own abilities, and it just isn't true. It just isn't true. I always think about that on the money part. Okay? If you look up at this board, which hasn't been updated for a couple of weeks, but the building fund is going to stay the same. How much is in the building fund? Those of you, Chuck, can you see that from there? How much is it?
$7,624.
$7,624. Now, I bring that up because this is a favorite story I like to tell. That we have put this roof on the church, and we paid about $23,000 or $24,000 for this roof. You know how much was in the building fund before we started that roof? $8,220. And we put on a let's just say $25,000 roof. How much is in the building fund? Boy, I wonder what happened there, Robin. You think that God might have had something to do with that? That we can look and see that He's able to accomplish a lot of things if we are going to be faithful enough. So why are we content with the status quo? Couple questions. Has God's kingdom been harmed by my lack of faith? Are there people that are not Christians because of my lack of faith? Because as an individual, as a church, I haven't stepped out to serve God the way that God wants me to serve Him. If I don't have any faith, why do I always try to stop those that do? Why am I always trying to oppose what is very obvious because it's not the way we used to do it or whatever reason it might be? Why then? That if I am not in favor of doing God's will, why don't I just step to the side and get out of the way? Why am I trying to stop others from serving God? Have I done that in my life? Have I caused people to be lost because of my lack of faith? Is the church not as strong as God intended for it to be because of my lack of faith? That's the decisions that we have to make. That with this lack of faith, it hinders my spiritual life, but also affects those people around me. God brings people, and God brings churches to crossroads. And we need to pray, and we need to seek out God's will, that we make the right decision. That we go the right way to see what God is showing us. And He is. He will. There's no doubt. He always has. And He will continue to do that. So if you were to determine yourself, are you a visionary or are you a stationary? Are you ready to look forward and go forward? Or are we going to be content just to stay where we're at? Now, if you are a stationary, then you need to ask why. If you're a visionary, then you need to ask why not. Why can't we? Wasn't that the famous speech by Robert Kennedy? Some people look at the world and say why, and others look at the world and say why not? Why can't we accomplish? Because if God is for us, in Romans 8 again, who can be against us? If He is there to show us and we follow Him, we cannot be defeated. We cannot. What happens to stationary water? become stagnant. What happens to stationary churches? They become stagnant. I forget the exact number, but I believe that in the United States of America, there are 4 churches that close their doors every week, never open again, at that rate. I can think when I was going down to Missouri and Central Christian College and preaching there, they couldn't find enough preachers to fill all the churches. Now there's no way they can find churches for all the preachers to preach at. And you go by and, well, there used to be a church, well, not there anymore, and just slowly, 4 every week. 4 every week. Why? Because someone, leadership, that chose to be stationary. It says, keep things the way that they are. Unbelief can keep us out of heaven. In fact, I believe that's the one sin that will not be forgiven, is our lack of faith, our lack of belief in Jesus Christ. But it also keeps Christians and churches from growing. So how far are we willing to grow with God? What kind of obstacles are we ready to face, knowing that God's going to see us through it, that we just need to trust Him, that we must decide that He knows the direction that He wants us to go. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister during the time of the Second World War. When Hitler came into Germany into power, he began to start dictating to churches what they could preach. And if you didn't go along with him, then we know they were called concentration camps. And a lot of the ministers of all churches in Germany began to bend to Hitler because they didn't want to be killed. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, no. He was making a stand. He was not going to bend at all. And some of the Lutheran ministers came to him and asked him to bend. They urged him to bend because they were going to face this great obstacle from Hitler if he did not. And that if they didn't bend, they wouldn't have the opportunity to preach at all. And I don't know how much you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but he made this statement that I think is a fantastic statement. One act of obedience is better than 1,000 sermons. Doing what God has shown us to do is far greater than anything that can be said. All this comes down to what we're going to do. Instead of being freed at some point in time from a concentration camp, Dietrich Bonhoeffer chose to stay there and died there so he could continue to preach to the prisoners in the concentration camps. So when we look at our lives, folks, 1,000 sermons cannot have the same influence as an act of obedience to God. Our hymn of invitation this morning and dedication is softly and tenderly. Jesus is calling us. Even as Christians, He is calling us. That He has brought us to this point for a reason. He has a purpose that He wants to accomplish in our lives, in the life of this church. Are we going to respond? Are we going to answer that calling His words? Let's stand together. It's going to be hymn number 3.